Welcome to YO Today. I'm Paul Peppis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Gabriele Hayden, Assistant Librarian for Research Data Management and Reproducibility in the Data Services Department of the University of Oregon Libraries. Prior to coming to the U of O in 2019, Hayden was a visiting assistant professor at Reed College, where she taught poetry and the poetics of translation. Hayden has a PhD in English literature from Yale University. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So how does one with a PhD in English literature find themselves to be a data management librarian? How did you tell us about that trajectory, how that journey?
Absolutely. The journey really amounts to that gap between when I was teaching at Reed College and coming here, which was about 5 years or so years. As you know, teaching and being a part of a university often involves not as much choice about where you want to live, and I knew I wanted to live here in Oregon. And so as the position at Reed was ending, I looked around for a living wage job, and there's work in tech. And so it was a really interesting transition from being in work where your identity is around your scholarship and your thinking to being a sort of, you go to work and you do your thing. I made that transition actually via volunteering with an organization called Hack Oregon that does open government data work and thinking about housing and working with the Portland Housing Bureau around visualizing their data. So learning about data that way, becoming competent in it, was a really fun process and really similar to, I had been very interested in language and translation in my scholarly work, and learning both the kind of jargon language of tech. I used that same skill, right? You go into learning a foreign language and you are talking to people and three of the words in the sentence you don't know, and you kind of pick them up from context. It's the exact same skill set.
Yeah.
And similarly with thinking about computational languages, they are in some ways very different, but in other ways there's a lot of the same skills when you're thinking about linguistic capacity. So that was really fun, and from there I found my way into kind of a business analyst consulting role. But when the opportunity came up for my family to make the move to Eugene, this role was magically available. And I thought, that looks like the coolest, most interesting thing ever, and what an amazing way to take that previous life and previous perspective and the technical competency that I developed and bring them together. And so I'm really at this moment now that I'm here of developing the narrative, of weaving those two together, in part through my interactions with people here.
Okay, fascinating. Well, let's hope that in the next 20 minutes or so you can help us understand this weaving together that you're attempting. So let's start with some basics. So what does data services do in the library, the Department of Data Services? What do they do?
Absolutely. So Data Services is part of a division within the library called Digital Strategies. And that's made up of the Data Services Department and then the Digital Scholarship Center. So in terms of thinking about the interest in humanities here, the Digital Scholarship Center works directly with scholars, often humanists and social scientists, on digital exhibits and sometimes other kinds of digital humanities projects where they're collaborating as well as consulting. The Data Services Department is more exclusively consulting. So we have a pilot statistical consulting service right now where we have GEs who are consulting with undergraduate and primarily graduate students on their statistical work. And we also offer services around how to manage your data, developing data management plans, plans for grants, but that can be understood to be a very broad concept. So often people will think, well, data, it must be in a spreadsheet or in a database. Data is really, for practical purposes, in our department, any kind of information that could be video or audio or citations that can be usefully, where you can use a computational technology to more usefully manage it in some way.
Okay, that's interesting. So tell us a little bit about how data management can help humanities people. So I'm a humanities person.
Right.
I'm like, okay, wait.
Right.
You're making me think I have data.
Absolutely.
So
you definitely do. So, I mean, some of it, the most low tech, let's say you're not a digital humanist, you're just, my early work was all, a lot of it was archival, looking at unpublished translations. And I spent a ton of time in archives. I once almost got bed bugs because I stayed with a friend who had bed bugs. Going to the Library of Congress, apropos of nothing. I didn't get them. But just thinking about that, the physical experience of the archives, I love thinking about that. But as part of that, right, you get all of these notes. You often, in that case, I was only there for a week, so I took pictures of an entire unpublished manuscript, right? There was a photograph of every page. So how do you keep track of those? Because as it turns out, over the course of a long project, our short-term memory is no longer good enough. We can't just, as an undergraduate, I would remember, well, in the orange book, it's sort of halfway in and I have a sticky note. That's not going to work for a big project. So managing those notes. So there are, Zotero is a great open source way of managing your citations, but you can also use it to keep track of some of those images, or there are other programs that you could use, say, to manage those archive images and keep the metadata with it. Metadata just means data about your data. So, which folder is it from, all that stuff that goes into when you're going to cite that, where it actually came from. So that's a very basic example, but then if you are a digital humanist or someone else who's dealing with larger bits of information, I can help you to think about best practices in managing your code, keeping copies of the versions, sharing that data through a data repository, making an interactive dashboard to help bring people into understanding the work that you do.
So how does one develop a data management plan?
That's a great question. A lot of it depends on what your goals are. So if you are writing your management plan for a grant, then there is a specific process, and we have a tool that we subscribe to called the DMP tool. We teach classes about it. That can help you walk through the requirements for your specific grant and what the grantor is looking for.
What does DMT stand for?
DMP, Data Management Plan.
Oh, DMP. Okay.
Yeah. Sorry. So that is sort of the bare minimum, what you would have to tell a granting organization. But at a deeper level, come to us at the beginning of your project, because just like it's easier to keep a clean room clean because you know where everything goes, it's easier to think now, come to us now and say, at the end of this, I want a website where it looks like this, or at the end of this, I'm going to analyze this data using natural language processing, and I'm hoping to come to these kinds of conclusions. If you come at the beginning, we can say, hey, when you begin to ingest that information, here's how you can structure it so that halfway through you don't have to restructure it. And here are the resources. Here's who you should talk to. Here's the workshop you should go to. Here's the skill sets. And we begin by asking, what are your existing competencies? How comfortable do you feel? And depending on what those are and what you're excited about, we can lead you down a technological rabbit hole, or we can kind of walk you through some very basic things that will make your life easier.
So, Assistant Librarian for Research, Data Management, and Reproducibility.
Yes.
So, reproducibility, if our audience knows that word at all, they probably are thinking about something that has to do with scientific research, right?
Absolutely.
So, in order for something to be legitimated as scientific knowledge, it needs to be reproducible.
Absolutely.
So,
right.
How does that work for humanities people?
That's a great question. I'm working on a paper about that right now with some colleagues. And I think it's somewhat contested. So some people would say reproducibility is a scientific paradigm, and that's not appropriate for some humanist and qualitative scholarship. And you can think, for example, of bird counts. If you count the number of birds that pass by a particular place at a particular time, that time does not recur, and so you can't recount those birds.
Right.
On the other hand, the analysis that you do of that data depends on the specifics of how the birds were counted and a lot of information about it. And so other parts of the analysis of that bird count could be reproducible. In the humanities, I like to think that a classic English paper has always been reproducible in the sense that I sit down and I read your analysis of Langston Hughes or of Paradise Lost, and you take me through, if it's a well-written paper, your thought process, and through your citations, you bring in a conversation with other people that is verifiable, right? So if you say, you know, Shakespeare said such and such, or Hamlet said such and such, then we can look at, well, which folio of Hamlet did you use? And you don't have to have that conversation, but someone can look at the version of Hamlet that you cited, and they can read those editor's introduction or footnotes and see, okay, you know, it's this folio, this is why they made that decision, and they could come back and say, I think that your argument only holds with one folio and not the other, and I disagree for such and such a reason, right? So there's a kind of transparency, and the process of getting to the argument is accessible, and in that sense can be reproduced because someone else can go back through it. And the challenge with digital humanities, there's more and more, I think there's a move towards openness in digital humanities data, but when you look at early work like the work of Franco Moretti, he would say, the data show this, as though that is clear, transparent, and not something to argue about. Right? Scientists know that when you say statistically, blah, 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 that is the beginning of a conversation, right? Not the end. To argue, like, statistics are something to argue about, not to say, and therefore I am right, right? And the challenge with humanists is that sometimes there's both developing the convention of sharing your data and the ways that your data were developed, and then there is the fact of other people's competency to enter that argument with you. So I think of old philological texts where they didn't bother to translate the Latin or the German because, well, obviously if you're reading this, you must know Latin and German, right? And we're at another moment where one of the things I want to think about and help scholars work with is if you are doing technical work, how do you invite scholars who are less technical into that work and help that be transparent in a way that they can engage in that conversation and argument.
Fascinating. So you just, in passing, alluded to the fact that a lot of humanities scholars feel proprietary about their work.
Yes,
and,
absolutely.
You know, one of the things about digital humanities, I mean, like, you know, peer-to-peer review, for example.
Right.
What are the benefits for people like me of sharing?
Absolutely.
Why should I do that?
100%. Great question. Really, it's the scientists ask the same question. We all want citations. One of the things that we're working on with developing data repositories, and the UO is just bringing online a dedicated data repository for sharing your data, is that that's another way to be cited, right? So that on the one hand, if you don't share your data, maybe no one can steal it. On the other hand, if you put your data in a repository with a citation associated with it, then you've kind of made your mark, right? You've said, this is my work, and if someone wants to use it in the service of furthering ideas, in accordance with academic honesty, they need to cite that work, and that's more credit that goes to me. There's also the opportunity to reuse the work of others. So you're giving them a citation, you're furthering their work, and you're allowing your work to have greater reach and strength. So I think it's a matter of broadening the scope of what the field can do, and but ultimately recognizing that everyone's out there surviving and trying to, you know, get those lines on the CV, thinking about publishing data as another line on the CV and as a way to, and one of the things we can do within the library is work with your citations and help you document, how often has this work been cited or downloaded, how often has this data been looked at by others.
Interesting. So let's talk a little bit more about what the library can help people like me with. So you mentioned in passing that there are these workshops that are offered.
Yes,
so tell us about
absolutely.
some of those workshops to learn how to manage research data.
100%. Yeah. So we have some of our workshops are in the line of language programming, so R and Python. For digital humanists, you might be interested. The Python sequence is going to end with a basic introduction to machine learning. That might sound sort of abstract, but if you've done text analysis or natural language processing, those are kinds of machine learning. And I used to find that sounded very fancy and complicated, and in order to design machine learning, you need to know a lot of math that I don't know. But in order to use machine learning, you don't need to learn very much at all, right? So that's a tool that you can use, and we can help introduce you to that. But we also have workshops out of the Dream Lab, out of the Digital Scholarship Center, in using Omeka and setting up WordPress, in those kinds of things that allow you to communicate your work to others. So you can think of it as kind of the back end, managing the data, and the front end of a website, communicating that data to others. And we have workshops that can help with both. We also help with, we also have workshops specifically around data management, planning. I'm sure I'm forgetting some on Excel.
That's good. That's fine.
And if you're a faculty member and you have an idea of something specific, if we have capacity, we'd love to work with you specifically to develop a workshop that could be coordinated in time and adjunct to your class or where we came into the class.
So one of the things that you guys do, and it's been a very great benefit for graduate students in the humanities, is to give this training to them.
Yes.
And in our experience in the English department, those of our grad students who have had these trainings, who have become competent in various forms of data management and digital humanities work, are faring better on the job market.
Oh, fantastic.
So tell us about the efforts of the library to train grad students in the digital humanities.
Absolutely. I mean, we're working on, we work regularly with the faculty in digital humanities here to get the word out about our projects, and we take very seriously when people start to come in and ask a similar set of questions, to really say, oh, maybe we need a workshop about that topic. But a lot of what we've done and the workshops we've had have been in response specifically to what's going on in the digital humanities and in other fields, and what are the identified needs. So, and we now have a website up that I will connect you with that has a list of all of the workshops that we regularly offer. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Great.
So one of the things that is occurring to me as you speak is ways in which digital humanities work, this kind of data management, might increase the legibility of the humanities, both within institutions and more generally to the public. You want to say something about that?
Absolutely. One of the really fun parts of my job, and one of the really interesting parts of having made this career transition, is learning to be kind of multilingual in a disciplinary sense, right? So that I come and talk to you, and I talk about the work of my department in the language as much as I can of the humanities, right? And I try to think about what are the words that will make sense to humanists and make them want to come and talk to me. And then when I go to the psychology department and the chemistry department, I do the same thing. And obviously I know way less about psychology and chemistry. I don't have a graduate degree in those fields. But I can read a few articles and get a sense of, like, what are the buzzwords and how are people thinking and feeling. So so that's part of what's been really been really fun about this work, and I think that part of what I want to give to humanists is a sense of just that basic control over the language of what they're doing and how it can be translated to and from the languages of technology and the languages of these scientific fields that have so come to dominate the university landscape. And also actually the language of business, right? So more than I thought. It was very interesting to spend a year and a half working with accountants and finance people in the private sector, because now I think when I look at like accountability, or like if we think about like a department making the case for itself or being numbers driven, like I've been in there with the accountants counting up what those numbers are and understanding how fungible they are and how definitions really can change the interpretation. I mean, numbers are subject to interpretation, and humanists can bring their skills of interpretation to numbers in the same way that they can to texts. And I really want to help people feel that they are empowered to do that.
Well, so I think some of us in the humanities feel that we know that to be a fact,
right.
But the institution that we operate within does
Absolutely.
not understand that.
Right.
So we're suspicious of efforts to metricize what we do.
100%. Yes, and it's a dangerous business, right? Especially, I mean, one question is like, who has control over defining those numbers, and the frame of that is everything.
Well, it's incumbent upon us in the humanities, I think, to be proactive in defining those things.
Absolutely.
For the institutions,
yes.
rather than having the institutions
yes.
define them for us.
Yes, and I think getting back to your point of how can we as humanists explain what we do, thinking critically about when to resist that kind of metrification and when to sort of seize the means of production of the metrification and define the terms thereof.
You need to come talk to a lot of people in the humanities about this. Well, so let's talk a little bit about your past life.
Yes.
So I want to talk about your scholarship, your career as a literary scholar. So your dissertation work was on translations by Ezra Pound, William Carlos Williams, and Langston Hughes of
yes.
Spanish language poetry. So
absolutely.
Why did you get to that? Why is that important?
Yes. You know, it started, I had the great privilege of taking a course in African American poetry from Elizabeth Alexander, who's now the head of the Mellon Foundation, an amazing poet and incredibly kind person. And she sent us to the Beinecke to do a paper.
The Beinecke, the greatest academic research library in the world. Okay.
Yes.
In my opinion.
Incredible, beautiful. It's all made of marble, which is just ridiculous, but more to the point, it has amazing archival resources. And I thought, okay, I'll just see what there is of Langston Hughes. And I was taking a course in literary translation at the time, and I thought, you know, I'll just see and I found these great translations of Langston Hughes into German during the 30s, and a little bit of correspondence around that. And I thought, wow, you know, what did Langston Hughes mean to Germans in the 30s, right at the beginning of like the rise of Hitler, and why, you know, what did these anthologies signify culturally in Germany? I thought it was totally fascinating. But of course, my German is not that great, and my Spanish is a lot better. And so then I thought, well, what about Hughes in Spanish? And I slowly found my way to these other works, and realizing that Pound and Williams also did this Spanish translation. And narratively it worked out really well, because Pound got to meet my fall guy, right? So he starts out as a Spanish major, but Spain and Spanish literature is sort of associated with femininity, with racial mixture, things that Ezra Pound does not wish to be affiliated with, right? So he sort of moves away from that. William Carlos Williams is, his family is from Puerto Rico, and when he corresponds, Ezra Pound calls him Dago Bill, right? Which is a slur against Puerto Ricans. And so William Carlos Williams is really kind of trying to like claim white privilege as a doctor and like a middle-class white guy who's also from Puerto Rico, and kind of navigating that, and sometimes really claiming the Spanish language literary traditions and saying, this is how I define, I am a United Stateser. And at other times really kind of separating himself from it a bit. And I think, you know, for many reasons, Langston Hughes comes out really beautifully here. He did so I love his work so much, and he did so many translations that later in his life he wouldn't do more Spanish translations without a publisher, because he was like, look, people won't, between him being African American and you know, the connotations of like no one's interested in Latin American literature, or those are all communists, or various things, it wouldn't get published. But he did such great and such interesting work. So I think telling that story was really valuable. It gave a really different insight into how those authors thought about their own literary style. And it's been fun to think about now in a different way, to think about like the connotations of programming languages, right? And how gendered they can be. I was teaching a workshop recently, and a very nice middle-aged white guy came in and said, is this the R class? Because I wasn't sure because of the demographic in the room, because it was mostly women. And I was like, oh, yes, it is. Anyway, so interesting stuff to think about.
So we've got about a minute and a half left.
Yes.
Did you use data management in your own research?
No, I am a great example of what not to do. I depended a lot. I was not into all this at the time. I depended a lot on my short-term memory. For metadata, I just took a picture of, you know, the archival folders have all the information right on. I just took the photograph with the metadata right in the frame. Better than nothing. But if I could go back and counsel my old self, I would have a lot of helpful advice.
How long did it take you to get yourself up to speed?
You know, it depends on where you count from, right? I mean, I spent a year working with this nonprofit, a year and a half at this old job, and then here, once you're familiar with certain kinds of technological things, they transfer really quickly. It's sort of like, you know, Portuguese, you're moving into Spanish, except even more so. It moves very quickly one into the other.
Well, Gabriele, it's been really interesting talking to you. Thanks so much, and we'll look forward to learning more from you and from the other people in data management services. Thanks. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much.
I've been speaking with Gabriele Hayden, Assistant Librarian for Research, Data Management, and Reproducibility in the Data Services Department of the University of Oregon Libraries. Thanks so much for watching.